Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe, you get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talk to the one and only Mike Levin. He has such a great story on how he got into ethics and compliance, and his approach to building programs is, I think, really smart. So he's been able to drive a lot of cultural change in the organizations that he's been in. So stay tuned and hope you enjoy this amazing conversation with Mike. Take care.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
All right, welcome to the Ethics Experts. So happy to have you on. I've been excited to get you on. I want to just kind of dive right in. I always like to start with people's story. Like, what is your life story? What kind of a kid were you? What was it like growing up? Because nobody, when I was a kid, I wanted to play baseball, and here I am in, the ethics space. So what kind of a kid were you then?
Boy, what was I kid? If you're going that far back, I had sort of a Huck Finn childhood. I grew up in rural Ohio, about 25 miles east of Cleveland. We had lots of woods behind us and a stream and a pond, and so my childhood was playing in the woods, going fishing, running around barefoot and muddy. And that was the kind of childhood I had. It was cold winters, so I would ski. We had little ski hills, and play with my friends, rode bikes, would be gone from morning till evening. When I'd hear the dinner bell ring, metaphorically, it's time to come back when the sun starts getting dark. And that's the kind of childhood I had. What led me here, a few haphazard, interesting decisions, risks. I went to college not knowing what I really wanted to do, and had a lot of fun in college. But I think the most challenging class I took was my senior year. One of the upper level electives was a consumer in the law class. And so that got me sort of thinking about law school, although I'd never thought about going to law school before then. Went back home to Ohio for a couple of years. My father ran a small business, and so I worked with him for a little bit. I think in the back of his mind, wanted me to take over the company, but I didn't really want to stay in rural Ohio. And so I got an internship volunteering for a judge in downtown Cleveland, and was like, if these guys can do this, I might be able to do this too. And then applied to law school and moved to Boston and sort of took off from there.
So what kind of a business did your dad have?
It was a small glass company. So my grandfather and his brother started a salvage yard when they were very young. Cool. And that became a salvage yard and auto parts business. And then it was auto parts and glass. And then it became a glass business. So glass fabrication, installation, that kind of stuff.
So looking back, what did that experience of being raised by an entrepreneur and working in a family business, did that add any perspective to you as you stepped into the business world?
Well, it was, I think it instilled in me sort of the work ethic. My father would tell a story when I was very young. So I was, I think, 7 years old when I would go on Saturday mornings with my dad. He'd pay me a quarter to sweep up broken glass in the shop. And so I started working when I was young. And my father would tell me a story of my grandfather when he was interviewing somebody for a job. The interview was going well. I think the guy had a good experience working in a glass shop before. And at the end, my grandfather said, "Do you have any questions for me?" And he said, "Can you tell me about your vacation plan?" And my grandfather's response was, "You start today," because he wasn't going to hire somebody who wasn't interested in the work. And so that was sort of instilled in me at a young age. You work hard, and good things will come afterwards, but you don't work with a mind towards just your time off. Now, that may fall in the face of sort of the work-life balance that we strive for now, but I think fundamentally it was more of the work ethic that was instilled in me. As I got older, I worked, part-time here and there, as a kid, and then in high school. One summer during college, I came back and worked for my dad's company. And we're talking a small, there were 10 employees. And that was sort of solidifying the fact that I really don't want to do this as a career. I don't want to be here. It was a noble profession. It was a great business. Being your own boss and being entrepreneurial is fantastic. And I think that taught me to take risks and to not be afraid to try anything new. So, right. After when I left my law practice, I'm jumping ahead a few years, I started to work for a startup, and had to dive in and learn things and do things that we had never done before just because they needed to get done. And so that was
Yeah.
sort of, I think that was instilled in me in an early age to not have the fear to try something new and to just say, okay, we got to figure this out, whatever this is, and just go do that.
Yeah. Entrepreneurship is really all just like solving new problems every day. It's just, you got to figure it out. There's no book for it. Do you remember in your senior year, what was about, or like what it was about that class you took that really kind of opened your eyes to like this new path that you ended up taking through law and where you're at now?
It wasn't that it was opening my eyes to a new path. It's that I had never really thought of that. While there were some attorneys in my family, a few like third cousins that I wasn't super close with. So I wasn't really around. I didn't grow up with lawyers. And as I said, I had a lot of fun in college. So my senior year, when I had to take my highest level elective and consumer in the law was available, I was like, all right, that sounds interesting. It was taught by a law professor. It was taught like a law school class, and I actually had to work because I was a smart kid. I went through all the stuff in high school that you do when you're a smart kid to prepare yourself for college, but I wasn't very directed.
Yeah.
And so I sort of had to really focus and sort of double down and dig into my inner scholar, which I hadn't exercised that muscle a lot in college because I could coast and do really well,
Yeah.
which is not a message I sent to the kids. So kids, if you're out there,
You can't coast and do well. Just anyone
stay in
listening.
school, study hard.
Work hard, get that scholar muscle moving now.
Exactly. Exactly. But I worked really hard, and the subject matter was interesting, and how we looked at precedent and how we looked at how consumer issues, consumer brands were marketed and the legal challenges that they faced. And it was very interesting. And that made me sort of lit a light that said, hey, maybe you could do this if that's something you want to pursue. And so when I came back to Ohio and I was like, all right, what do I want to do? I worked for my dad for the summer. I was like, not going to do that. Got a job in a ski shop because I like to ski and I figured I'd get some discounts on equipment, which I did. I got to ski a lot over the winter. And then after about 10 months, I'm like, I'm not going to work in a ski shop forever. It's time to think about what to do. And that's when I got an internship working for a judge. And I figured if I do that for a few months and I feel at home there, and I see myself in that world, then I'll apply to law school. And it was really interesting because after, excuse me, after 3 months there, the judge had some personnel issues with her bailiff, and think of bailiff as the clerk of courts, not the gun-toting sheriff's bailiff. And that position became open. And the judge came to me and said, Mike, you know what's going on with both the civil and the criminal docket. You've been here shadowing the bailiff for 3 months. I will give you this job with one condition, which is if you're still here in a year, I'm going to fire you because I don't want you to become a lifer working as a clerk at the courts. You are destined for bigger things. So I want you to go to law school. And so that was really an amazing opportunity. I was the youngest bailiff in the Court of Common Pleas in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, in Cleveland at that time, and did it for a year. It was fascinating. Got to manage the juries during sequestrations for capital murder cases, got to do all the docketing, all the scheduling, got to meet all the lawyers, got to open court, oyez, all that good stuff. And it was a really great experience as a lead-in to go to law school.
So you did this internship. Hey, am I going to feel at home here? You obviously did. You got to do this bailiff position, which is very rare for somebody at your age.
Which paid pretty well for a 22-year-old kid.
Yeah, probably better than a quarter for sweeping up glass. You know what I mean?
Much better. Yeah.
So how did you decide that next step? Like it was probably pretty clear pretty early on that this was something that you wanted to pursue.
Yeah.
You chose to go to law school, out of that. I'm sure that you didn't get fired at that 1 year mark.
I did not. I left on my own.
So when you got into law school, I'm always fascinated by people's path through law school because there's just 1,000 paths out of it. It's like everybody comes in and then you go 1,000 different ways. So
exactly.
talk me through like what that experience was like, what was surprising about law school, and how did you start to gravitate toward one path over another?
Yeah. So I found law school to be a really interesting intellectual exercise. It was challenging. It caused me to use those muscles that I didn't use as much as I should have in college and undergrad. And there's a set curriculum. You take your criminal law, you take your constitutional law, you take your civil procedure, and all those things, and sort of find your way through that. I think what steered me was really the internships that I was able to get. So,
Okay.
having worked for a judge on the administration side, I got a job working, or a clerkship working for the Superior Court of Massachusetts. I went to school outside of Boston, and got to write briefs, got to sit in all the court proceedings. It was very interesting. Helped the judge write his briefs, and
That's cool.
and that sort of was like, okay, well, I'm going to go. So you see prosecutors, you see defense attorneys, and it sort of puts your mind in that path. You think that's kind of where I'm going to go. And I had another internship for the Attorney General of Massachusetts. Back then it was Scott Harshbarger and the trial division. So I got to work with those attorneys defending the state in matters. And that was really interesting. And so that was sort of where I thought I was headed. And then I got a part-time job working for a small law firm that was a general practice firm. And they made me an offer after graduation. I was there, I knew what was going on. I was like, well, I guess this is where I'm going to be. And so I did that for a while, and realized kind of quickly that it wasn't really fulfilling me. It wasn't where I wanted to be. I wanted to do something a little more proactive. I felt like we would counsel clients, they wouldn't take our advice, then we have to go help them clean up their mess. Or we'd be, doing some trial work. And I loved going to court. That never sort of waned from even when I was a bailiff, just the excitement of the courtroom. And then on the other side of the bench, when you're actually arguing, that was a lot of fun. So I really enjoyed that. I didn't enjoy everything that led up to that. So the motions practice, the interrogatories, discovery, all that kind of stuff, which back then there was no e-discovery. It was all pen and paper.
It was all by hand. Yeah.
But I found that I wasn't being as fulfilled as I thought I would be or should be. And so I decided, and that was at about year 3. But I didn't know what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go. And so I stayed for almost 3 more years. And during that time, I started networking, and I met someone in the Boston area who had just started a company. It was called Integrity Interactive.
Oh, cool.
And so they were looking for lawyers to do business development to help build that business.
Cool.
And this was
who was it?
Sorry?
Who was it?
Kirk Jordan.
Cool. Yeah.
So I don't know if you know Kirk. So Kirk and Joe Murphy, basically the brains behind Integrity Interactive on the compliance, ethics, legal side. And then there was Carl Nelson on the business side, and Russell G. and a handful of others. But they were looking for lawyers to
build that content,
evangelize the marketplace. Enron had just happened. WorldCom and Tyco were just happening. So corporate compliance and ethics was not household corporate words. There were no offices of compliance. General counsels did some of it. Maybe HR did a little bit. If you were an aerospace defense company, you had some of those programs going back to.
But it was not nearly as pervasive,
It was not what it is today. In fact, there were really only 2 vendors. It was Integrity Interactive and LRN, who were the 2 vendors to the space. Cool. And so for a couple of years, myself and one other former recovering lawyer, a former prosecutor, Pete and I were just pound the pavement, knocking on doors, having meetings with general counsels to say, let's talk about your compliance program. And the response we usually got was, or what? And so
that's so cool.
To talk to them about what a compliance program was, how they can build it, it was less about culture than in building all the marketing and the training communications around it, as it was, what risks do you have? How can you train employees to avoid those risks? And so was fortunate that I think the marketplace became ripe with the scandals. We were at a good time, at a good place, and we're able to develop a pretty large client base within a short period of time, such that Integrity Interactive needed to create an advisory services function that was more formal. And so I moved over out of business development and started doing that kind of consulting work with clients.
How did you find business development to be?
Well, I sold skis, and if you sell one thing, early in your life, you sell one thing, you can sell anything.
I would bet that you sales is always hard. Business development's always hard, but it seemed like you probably did well in it.
Yeah. We were successful. We were such that, the company ultimately got acquired by SAI Global a few years later.
Yeah.
And, you look at the marketplace now, there's a lot
How
of people
crazy is
fighting.
that though? I mean, you got to look at it now and see like, I mean, you were there you guys were like Lewis and Clark or something.
It felt a little bit like that. We were,
Yeah.
on a journey, and it was the Conestoga wagon and the dirt roads and trying to figure out our way and like looking, do we take that road or that road? Um, I remember the first year that I went to SCCE, their annual conference, which was, I think the first year it was sort of not at Microsoft campus, because the very first year, I think they had 50 people.
Interesting.
And there weren't that many more the first year that it was open to everybody outside of Microsoft. Um, and it's such a different world today when you go to those conferences.
Oh, it's crazy.
The
Yeah.
growth it's remarkable. And it's kind of fun to think back on those days when you walked into the room and you knew everybody because there were only a handful of people there. And it's been fascinating to watch this field grow.
Wow. That's so cool. Okay. So then you moved over to the advisory side and
Moving
there
advisory
you're,
side was, we'd help new clients identify risks, build programs. We would, we'd be joined at the hip at some point, in some cases with the business development folks to go on sales calls to sort of, they would get the meetings and then we would speak the compliance speak,
right.
and talk about risks and compliance and ethics and building programs. And that was really fun because you got to work with lots of different companies, lots of different industries, global, domestic, huge footprints, and figure out how to build something that works and not only is effective for the sentencing guidelines, but also actually moves sort of the cultural needle and
Yeah.
answers the problems and the questions that they were trying to solve. So it was fascinating and very rewarding.
Yeah. Kind of a constant puzzle. And you got exposed to so much that I'm sure totally influenced you later in your career.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. You got to
so
see what works in companies, what doesn't work. You got to see leadership of compliance programs, even at the early age when they weren't called compliance programs. They were general counsel who wore a second hat or HR who wore a second hat, and see what they were doing that was effective and what they were doing that wasn't. And then you could leverage that for the next client. And then obviously later when I went in-house as a compliance officer.
do you think the like range of what's the word I'm thinking of? Like the range of like commitment to quote unquote compliance was wider then than it is now, or do you feel like it's always kind of been the same? Do you know what I'm asking? Because like it's
Um,
more pervasive now. These programs are everywhere, but I'm sure I'm just kind of picturing you going along with the biz dev folks, and you're talking to all these different leaders. These are a bunch of different personality types. There's a bunch of different views as to the extent to which you can affect the culture and like the value that actually has on de-risking the company and things like that. Like, do you find that like spectrum has changed over time, or do you think it's just kind of consistently a certain like?
I think for companies who realize they need to build a compliance program, it's pretty open field. Now, they're always restricted by budget, you may have a compliance officer who gets it and wants to get it done, but they don't have full buy-in. They have like
Yeah, right.
notional buy-in from executive leadership, but they are a little hamstrung on budget or resources, so they have to temper what they're trying to accomplish. And for those, you can still build a great program. You just have to look at your scope and really focus on the most key risks. Lots of companies
Right.
try to bite off who have large worldviews of their compliance and ethics program, say, we're going to build a world-class program. They may bite off too much, which, at an early time, which means they kind of stumble along the way. Whereas those who can do something narrower that focuses on the key risks, but build really strong programs, they tend to be able to open the aperture over time
Yeah,
and
it's
do
like
more.
focus on the few things that you can do well and get those big building blocks in place. Otherwise, you're going to have a bunch
Exactly.
of half-built,
Right.
models or something. Yeah.
And then on the flip side, there are those companies who have had a death or near death experience, where they either have a deferred
Yeah.
prosecution agreement, they're being investigated, they had an SEC violation, you name it. They tend to get religion early, or
Yeah.
quickly, and throw lots of resources at it and address the problem, build great programs, get past the specter of the scandal. And then over time, you see some of those wane because, like, okay, we did that, we checked that box, and now we can focus our resources somewhere else. And over time, they might wind up in hot water again because
Yeah, because
things.
it's a bonfire. It's not like you flip the
Exactly.
switch and you say, okay, cool, we're compliant. People change,
Right.
circumstances change, habits change, all that.
Right.
Uh,
Exactly.
so after Integrity Interactive, what caused that next move and what did that
Sure.
look like?
So after I did the advisory services stint at Integrity, I moved into a role that was doing more new product, new service development, sort of R&D, if you will, around compliance
Cool.
to try to figure out what companies need next. And so I
Okay.
did a lot of work and a lot of research around third-party due diligence and the compliance side, and built some due diligence questionnaires, automated services that Integrity could offer to companies and help to sell those. After doing that, I had done just about everything there was to do at Integrity over nine and
Right.
a half years, with the exception of sort of the IT computer coding of the web-based training, which is I'm not equipped to do nor would ever be equipped to do. So I figured, where am I going to go from here? The logical place was to go in-house and actually try to practice what I'd been preaching as a
Right.
consultant on the advisory services side. And so I got a job working for BAE Systems, their largest U.S. Subsidiary, the electronic solutions sector up in Nashua, New Hampshire. I lived in Boston, so it was a 30-minute reverse commute. Um, and and that was my first time working in-house, actually running a program. And I was the director of ethics and business conduct. And it was about 15,000 US employees as part of a bigger 50, 60,000 employee, US employee company. BAE is, obviously uh, part of BAE Systems PLC in England,
Yeah.
which is a much bigger company, former British Aerospace, and was really happy doing that work. Was getting to the different subsidiaries, locations around the U.S. Built a network of local ethics officers, which they hadn't had before, and was doing
Wow.
some really cool stuff.
And when was this around? Around this was what?
This was
Around
2009,
15 or something? 12? 2009. Okay.
9 or 10,
Yeah,
2010,
yeah.
excuse me, started in 2010.
Okay.
And so BAE had just come off a big scandal in if you've ever read the Wolf Commission report, BAE was the first company, I think it was a $247 million, maybe 267 million. I can't remember the exact fine because it's a long time ago, for bribery. And as a result, they were obviously, like I said, they got religion and they were putting more resources to their programs. So they hired me in that division. They were hiring other folks in other divisions to build up those programs. So I got to do that. It was a great environment to do it. And then report sort of dually to the president of the sector in New Hampshire, as well as the president of BAE Inc. in the US, which was down here in the DC area. And so sort of dual reporting, all the internal investigations, management, culture, code of conduct, all that kind of stuff that runs part and parcel of an ethics program. And at the 10th month mark, I got a call from a recruiter who said, "Hey, we saw you on LinkedIn. Would you like to talk about this role?" And my response, frankly, was, "Actually, I just got here 10 months ago. I'm really happy. I don't want to talk to you, but I know people who are looking. So if you're free in 2 weeks, when I'm free, I'll talk to you." And so 2 weeks go by. I hadn't given it a thought until I saw it on my calendar, and I met with the recruiter. And they said, "Let me tell you about the role." And they told me about the role. They hadn't yet disclosed the company. And after they spent 10 minutes saying it's this global role, it's this, that, and the other thing, I was like, "Actually, I'm really interested."
Yeah,
So
that sounds actually a little more interesting. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so I threw my hat in the ring. The company was Boeing. And
Cool.
so I got the job. And so I was only with BAE for about 14 or 15 months, and moved down here from the Boston area to the DC area. And I was the head of Boeing ethics for Boeing International, which is all their non-US employees in about 70 countries, as well as Boeing's government operations group, which is all the
Cool.
lobbyists, which is why they were based here in DC. And that was great work. It was fascinating. I managed an international team for the first time, traveled all over the place. In fact, after my first 3 weeks getting settled here in DC, I went to Asia for a month, had
Wow.
an offsite for all my employees and got to know everybody. And it was just fascinating. Similar to BAE, but on a much bigger global scale. Sexier issues, conflicts of interest, and code of conduct and investigations and all that kind of stuff. But it was eye-opening to, even though when I worked at Integrity Interactive and helped global companies scale their training globally, I hadn't drafted a
Yeah,
global
right.
code of conduct for one company, and I got to help do that. And I managed conflicts of interest for the entire enterprise for Boeing. And it was fascinating. And I
Let's,
did that.
oh,
Good.
please if we can, I'd like to go back to the BAE experience. What was
Sure.
surprising about coming in house, right? Because you had talked to dozens and dozens of companies in the in the business development capacity and the advisory capacity.
Yeah.
What was surprising about putting, forgive me, but these theories into actual practice within the organization yourself?
Yeah. So putting them into practice wasn't as challenging as the internal politics of getting the buy-in from everybody, even
Okay.
though they were coming off of a scandal and a huge fine, where you would have
Interesting.
thought everyone's like, yeah, whatever you need, get it done. There was
Yeah.
still a lot of pushback at times from different
And
folks.
what was that rooted in?
Just they had never done it
Whatever.
before. Why do we have to do this? I know Inc., the parent company in DC, has to do this, but why do you have to do this in Nashua and the other, in Austin, Texas, and the other places where we
Yeah, yeah,
have manufacturing plants? What's it going to do for us? And so it really sort of taught me um, sort of the art of the sell of
yeah.
selling the why, and talking about how this can help them with the bottom line. And what also helped was establishing the network of the local ethics officers that I mentioned
Yeah, yeah.
before. They didn't have an ethics presence in all the different locations before. And now that they did, and it wasn't somebody that I hired and planted there, it was somebody who worked there. They were program managers or they were process engineers. And they had this as a like 25 or 20% adjunct to their role. And I had to negotiate that with the different site leadership to say, this is what Inc. wants to establish this program. And this is how the best way to do that is to have people on the street who are familiar. You don't want somebody
Yeah,
from
exactly.
Nashville coming down and telling you what to do. You want somebody in-house who who's worked there for 10, 15, 20 years, who's already a friend, to talk about,
Trusted, knows the
how
plant, knows the
exactly,
business, all that.
exactly.
How did you identify those people?
I
And
initially went to the,
how did you create this network? Because it didn't exist at one point, and then at some other point it did,
right. It didn't exist. And so I talked to the sector president and said, we need to get buy-in at the grass level. We need to have somebody local who is a known commodity. And I asked him what he recommended. I mean, I had in the back of my mind, it's like, I should go to section leadership at each location and ask them who they would nominate.
Yeah.
And to nominate several people, and I would go and interview them. And that's ultimately what we did. And so I can recall one person in particular, who was head of security at the location. Farthest thing from compliance. I mean, he used to be with, I think one of the, I can't remember which president, but one of the Secret Service details for one of the presidents. And then, he retired and went in-house at BAE and managed security. Ultimately, he was our selection, and had been doing it for a few years, was looking for something different that would challenge him. He was always a by the book kind of guy. He believed in policy, he believed in following the rules because that's how he came up
Yeah.
through the Secret Service. And when he got the opportunity to do this, this is just an extension of what I already think internally, and I want to be able to share that with other people that I work with. And so he got the nod. He was amazing. He would lead sessions. He would, do briefings on whatever topic we needed: conflicts of interest, code of conduct, gifts, and entertainment. And when I left, I got the nicest note from him and a little leather-bound folio that had the Secret Service insignia on it. And the note
Cool.
said something to the extent, I think I still have it, to the extent of, you recharged my career here after several years of sort of complacency. And it was just
Wow.
really great to have that kind of impact, because he certainly helped me
Totally.
and made a great impact on the enterprise where he worked, that location. It worked out really well.
I've this has been kind of in vogue now recently, this like champions network or compliance champions, whatever. And the resistance I've heard, we've done a bunch of webinars on this topic, and the thing I've heard time and time again is, how do I find the people, or like, how do we compensate them for it? And in my experience, there are people at all these locations that probably resonate with this and they will want to do it.
Yeah.
And like, this is such a great example of somebody who, you were able to help him reframe and bring a new perspective to really recharge his career. Did you see a sort of commonality across those champions that you started to quote unquote hire or bring into the fold? Like what is the through line that you'd see consistently?
Yeah, so the through line is certainly not position or role, because we had security guards, we had project managers, we had program managers, we had engineers. The through line was they got it. They were sort of they really believed in accountability, doing the right thing, saying what they're going to do, following through. It's not that they were Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, because that's a little too strong, but they just they had that sort of
They were wired
intangible
that way or something.
that you want in an ethics and compliance officer. They just didn't know that they could focus it that way. I also wanted to make a comment on people not knowing how to compensate them. So I was able to negotiate with business leaders at those sites that since they were going to give us 20%, or in some cases 25% of someone's time, that we would put an objective in their annual compensation objectives, their business competencies, that was worth 20% of what they did. So if they met those objectives, then they would get that in their bonus.
Great. That's a great way to do it.
Yeah.
Again, maybe it's that entrepreneurial thing. Maybe it's just how you're wired, but there's just always a way to solve the problem. There just is,
Yeah, absolutely.
So, thanks for sharing that. So, the Boeing move you made, you're doing all this international work. I want to hear a little bit about the difficulty or the challenge or the lessons that you may have learned in rolling out this international code of conduct, or rolling out training in this sort of, across all these different cultures and all these different jurisdictions, and how that may have been more difficult or more interesting than you maybe initially, thought.
Yeah. It was not dissimilar to working with different locations from BAE that were around the US, in that it was the same muscle. You had to build relationships with so Boeing has country presidents. So they're US expats that go to Japan and they run Boeing's Japan operations for a period of time, usually 2 to 4 years, sometimes longer. And so you have to build those relationships. And because we had international local hires, ethics folks in those regions, they would sit on those leadership team meetings. And so we build those relationships. We talk about what the needs are, what the challenges are with those businesses, and then what resonates the most. Because different cultures obviously resonate. It's not just about translating your code of conduct, your policies, and your training. There's cultural sensitivities to how you talk about different things. And so we had the benefit of having international local hires manage those regions. They reported back to me, and I reported up to the head of the Office of Internal Governance at Boeing, which was the group that managed international trade controls and audit and some other things. And so I would build those relationships. Part of that month-long trip that I took around Asia was meeting with all the country presidents of all the countries that we operated in there, to build that relationship. And this is, I think, been a common theme that I have found. And maybe it's not revolutionary. It's not. Maybe it's common to most folks. But what has resonated with me is that if you need to work with somebody, and you need something from them, whether it's to help launch a compliance initiative, whether it's to help launch a product, you can't call them out of the blue if you've never met them. And so build the relationships, irrespective of need for getting something done. And then when you have a need, as long as you've nurtured that relationship, it's not that hard to make the call. Exactly. You become a known entity then. And I think that's been, I don't know if it's a key to success, but it's been one factor in how I've been able to do what I've been able to do at the companies I've worked in.
So that is, I think it's a key to success for sure. It seems very, when you put it that way, it seems very obvious, but why do you think people, why doesn't everyone do that? What is it? Do they just not, is it a positional authority thing?
Well, it may be positional authority. It may be, they're senior to me. I couldn't possibly go meet them. It may be some of that. But most recently at my last job, people have taken the Myers-Briggs tests and the different personality profiles. We did one called Clifton Strengths in the last year that I had never done before. And there's an element that I had in my profile that was kind of weird. It's the acronym is WOO. It's winning others over, and only I think they said less than 2% of people who take that test, and millions of people have taken it, have WOO.
Wow.
And so whether that's an innate ability to build relationships or a lack of fear to put yourself out there and say, hey, we haven't met before, instead of like standing in the, on this,
waiting to get called into the game or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. You just sort of throw yourself in there, and maybe it's part of the entrepreneurial spirit of, it's sort of, to quote Bull Durham, like fear and ignorance. You don't know how bad it's going to be, so just jump right in.
Yeah, right.
And so just put yourself out there. What's the worst that's going to happen? It can only help you down the road. So, foster the introduction, keep it going, and then work with them, find out, be inquisitive, ask questions like what are your what's challenging you? What are your pain points? Is there anything I can do to help?
Right.
And if you're, genuine in that, which, I think a naturally inquisitive kind of people person.
Yeah.
Then you build those relationships. They just happen organically over time.
Yeah. It's just an organic sort of natural thing that grows.
Right. Exactly. And so,
so that's interesting, right? I mean, 2% of people, there's probably a much lower percentage in our space that have that woo factor. And so,
so in my last company, we were, compliance rolled up to enterprise risk.
Okay.
400 people, only 2 people had woo, had that. Yeah.
That's crazy. So let's talk about that a little bit. Well, I'd love to hear any other big lessons that you carried from, I mean, I'm sure there's 1,000, but like which ones really stand out? Because I mean, again, you have to craft this message across these different countries, these different cultures. You have to kind of like tune your ear to the sensitivities and how you say things and how you get things done. Those are not kind of consistent across all those different borders. What are some of the other, cool experiences there that you really carried with you and that were formative for, the later impacts that you made?
Well, the coolest thing about working internationally, especially for a very large company, is the investigations and the allegations that come through. There's some really
crazy, right?
Wall stuff that you see, and thankfully, nothing pervasive. But you get to see some juicy stuff, and that keeps your days interesting. I mean, this business comes down to, compliance and ethics it's individual people doing the right or the wrong thing every day, and how do they show up to work, and your chance at influencing them and how they do that. And so the majority of folks are going to show up to work. They show up for the paycheck, they show up for the mission, or a combination of both. And they do their jobs, and they do them dutifully, and they're decent people with well-intentioned. There's a small thin number of people who just they're looking to better themselves, better their position, better their role, whatever, through any means possible. And those are the ones where you're going to get lots of allegations. And then there's a small percentage of folks who they didn't pay attention. They're ignorant of the rules. They didn't make a misstep. It was not nefarious. It was not intentional, not malicious. So deal with those. But you're going to find really interesting issues across the boards. And the bigger the company, the more global the reach, the more interesting and sort of outlandish
crazy
some of the So if I take one thing away, it's that never underestimate human beings' capacity for doing just ridiculous, bizarre things that they thought were right, or just knew blatantly were wrong.
Yeah. We are all kind of, at some level, we're all kind of like rationalization machines, and it's crazy what people can rationalize into,
Oh yeah. I mean, when you think about the fraud triangle and that rationalization piece is it's remarkable what people
is remarkable.
Passable.
Yeah. So, after Boeing, you went where?
After Boeing, so again, I was really happy at Boeing. Didn't think when you've worked
story of your life, it sounds like, you know what I'm
saying? I've been fortunate a couple of times. So I was at Boeing for about 3 years when I got a call from a recruiter again. And at that point I was like, I'm at the top of the game. I work for the largest U.S. exporter, one of the most household names in the country, in the U.S., known globally.
Doing cool stuff.
Had a great team. Really enjoyed it. But there was, but I was one I was a director of ethics and business conduct for, as I said, Boeing International, Boeing Government Operations. But there was one of me for the defense business. There was one of me for the commercial airplanes business, and there's one for the Boeing credit, operations and commercial credit business. And so I wasn't in charge of everything.
Yeah.
And sometimes I got frustrated that I would have done some things differently, whether it was the rollout of the code of conduct training for the entire enterprise. I might have done that slightly differently. I had a seat at the table, but I didn't have the final word. And so I got a call from a recruiter who said, Freddie Mac is looking for a new head of ethics. And my response again was, I'm not interested. I've been here for only 3 years. I got a lot more I can do. And they said, well, is there anything about your current job at Boeing that you don't like? And I said what I just said to you, which was like, I don't have the final say. I'm not the ultimate decision maker to shape what the enterprise program will look like. And they said, well, you would be here. And
it's a good recruiter.
Yeah, good recruiter. So I took the meeting. I had dinner with, and the first meeting was actually with the chief compliance officer at the time. Met her for dinner, had a great conversation. And
you wooed her.
What's that?
You wooed her.
I don't know if I wooed her.
I'm kidding. You can't help yourself.
It was more the other way around. I think she wooed me. But at the end, it was a really interesting and appealing offer for a couple of reasons. One, completely different industry. Financial services is not aerospace and defense. And I'd be, learning a lot that I didn't know before because I didn't grow up in the finance industry and I hadn't worked in it before. And the downside, so that was the upside, was get to build something from scratch. And the downside was it's a company in conservatorship since the financial crisis in 2008. And I always harken back to, I did have to go through the interview process, even though I met with the chief compliance officer that first time. One of the head of regulatory affairs said to me as the last question in the interview was, why would you like to come work for a company in conservatorship with an uncertain future? Because Congress had been talking for years about disbanding Freddie and Fannie. And my response was, I don't know that I do. You contacted me. You wanted to
you called me, buddy. Yeah, you took me to dinner.
So the interviews went well. I got the offer and I was weighing back and forth. And I actually have had an uncle, my late uncle, was a former a retired CEO of a large company. And I would always bounce ideas off of him. So I called him and I said, I'm wrestling with this. I've got a great gig. They're paying me well. It's interesting. Do I want to do this? And he said, well, if you play your cards right, you will learn something that only one other person will learn. And that's the person who has your job at Fannie Mae, because no one else has gone through a company, in conservatorship like Freddie or Fannie. It's a duopoly.
Yeah, right.
Who does that? And
that's a good point.
Even if Congress decided to disband them, it would be a long wind down. So it wouldn't be like I'd be just terminated right away.
Good point.
And so I took the job. I figured, what have I got to lose? And it was a really fascinating, interesting ride. I was there for a little over 10 years and learned a lot.
I bet.
A lot about risk management because when I joined, compliance was an individual, independent division reporting to the CEO, and then merged a few years later into enterprise risk. Made sense for lots of reasons, for financial risk management and the 3 lines of defense for risk management. And so learned a ton, learned about how, the mortgage market, secondary mortgage market, learned about financial services, learned about, got my anti-money laundering certification, did manage that team for a short time, managed privacy for a short time as an interim after someone retired, and just got exposed to a lot that I wouldn't have seen, and got to direct the entire ethics program and manage a bunch of different compliance functions as well. And so it was fascinating. It was a great ride.
Man, so what was that like coming into it in conservatorship and getting that baton passed from the prior chief compliance officer in the midst of that storm?
So the chief compliance officer, I wasn't taking her job. She remained. I was the chief ethics officer.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
And so the challenge for me there was, and the reason they needed somebody was the seat had been vacant for a year. And the two previous chief ethics officers were there for 11 and 11 and a half months only, and then left for different reasons. And so there were about 3 years of stagnation where it was a small team, very capable team that were without leadership and sort of were just there responding to allegations or inquiries. There was no proactive.
Yeah, they're just bailing water out of the boat. They weren't rowing it forward.
They weren't rowing. And so we completely turned that over, did a 180. Revamped all the policies. The code of conduct at that point was, I think, 50 pages, dense, single space,
Times New Roman, no margin type pages.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, you got to make these things digestible for employees if they're going to be impactful. And so we did that. We converted the code of conduct, updated the values with leadership, revamped the code,
updated values even.
Yep.
Yeah, wow. What was that like? I mean, again, that's a big undertaking in a way.
Yeah. Well, we had a change in leadership, and whenever there's a change in leadership, provided it's not like close in proximity to each other, I think it makes sense to revisit things like that and say, are we on the right path? The mission stayed the mission, which was an important mission. But it's great to have a new CEO put their thumbprint on how you communicate these things. And how you do that is through the values. It's like, how do you want us to operate the business to achieve the mission? And so you got to give the new CEO, an opportunity to do that. And he or she may consult with the board to say, is it the right time to do this? When did we most recently do this? And we can help through that process. And we did. And we didn't make a wholesale change. We just tweaked it a little bit.
Yeah.
I think there had been 6 value statements, and we condensed them to 4 because nobody can remember 6. I mean,
yeah, right. Exactly. I can barely remember my own phone number. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I know what you mean. And so we did that. We really had a great launch with the code of conduct. In fact, I gave us a presentation at SEC about, I think it was called 5 months to a 5 months to a new code of conduct, 5 months to a fabulous code of conduct, something like that. We built little infographics to make this stuff resonate better, so people could at a glance see. Actually, I have it right here.
I'd love to see it. Yeah.
We designed these little desk drops for all employees that have little infographics.
Cool.
About, creating a respectful workplace, see something, say something, making ethical decisions, avoiding conflicts of interest. And then at the very end, a little glossary. And while these were linkable within the code of conduct itself, so people they didn't have to read 3 paragraphs. They could just look at that and say, oh, okay, speak up, be accountable, report concerns, seek advice. That's simple. How do I do that? There's the number, there's the webpage. Same things with conflicts of interest and disclosing those kinds of things. So we made it really user-friendly. And as part of it, we did a desk drop where every employee came to work one day and they had one of these, and we call them code rings because they had a little ring and you could hang it on a pin in your cube.
Yeah.
When everybody was going to the office. And then we would on a monthly basis do it was like a game. It was a trivia contest where we would post questions to the home front page, which was the landing page when you log into work with your newsletters and everything for the daily news at work. And people who got that right were invited at the end of the year. Well, they were put in a bin. We picked out 3 winners and we did like a Jeopardy game. We had a TV studio on campus.
Cool.
For doing all the marketing and communications. And so we actually did a Jeopardy-like game. And the winner got a free vacation, an extra vacation day. But it was a way to sort of win the hearts and minds of employees and get them really thinking about the code and the different parts of the code that impact their business. Because, the antitrust part of the code of conduct doesn't impact everybody unless you're in sales or marketing. The conflict of interest, mutual respect, that's ubiquitous across the enterprise. And so we could tease out different things that would really resonate with people, get them talking about it. We actually also, when we updated the values, we did an art exhibition where we invited the children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews, if you didn't have children, of employees to create a piece of art based on one of the values.
Wow.
And submit it.
I've had people love that.
We didn't have sculptures, but we had collages, we had paintings, we had drawings. And then I rented, we got a small budget for it. Didn't cost much. and rented these movable walls and put them in the atrium in the building and posted all the pictures up and invited all the kids after school for a couple of days to come and have an exhibition. And their parents were there. And it was really cool. It was a great way to get people to think about the values and the code of conduct and to make it more personal for the employee base.
Yeah. And I mean, it's such a pattern interrupt,
Yeah.
See a bunch of little kids running around in a new wall of art. And I think that's so smart. I bet that the impact was like big.
The impact was huge.
Huge. I'm not just saying of like the art thing, but just this whole kind of approach where there was this new leadership, new values, desk drops. Like there was a lot of effort. I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of an employee who maybe, presumably over the last couple of years, not like the whole organization was like, devoid of values, but it seems like it was a totally new chapter once you joined and you and your team were able to start really putting some effort into this. Like, Can you talk to me a little bit about, I maybe just maybe respond to this. I think there's like two layers of this communication, right? There is the layer of like, okay, here are the new values, but then there's also this sort of more ethereal sort of like wrap around of that communication where like people on a subconscious level are like, oh, wow, the company must really care about this if we're constantly hearing about it. And every day there's a new question and we're doing a freaking Jeopardy show. And like, there's all these like innovative, attempts to like drive these values forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think sometimes we get too caught up. I think sometimes folks get too caught up in that sort of base layer of communication, when I think that sort of second ethereal, sort of more subconscious communication is really what ends up driving the behavior. That's really what ends up influencing people more.
Yeah. So I think my approach has always been, I think, sort of impacted by whenever I first heard a radio ad and they, call this number and they repeat the number 6 times. It's like, you gotta keep having marketing impressions on people or else it's not going to really stick.
Right.
And so you can't just say the values 5 times in a row and expect them to stick. You have to bring them to people in different ways so different people, some people might resonate with a picture. Some people want to hear it. Some people want to read it. And so as long as you provide those impressions, marketing term, not a marketing scholar, but I've always viewed it as sort of selling compliance and ethics. And I wrote a resource paper once that a few years ago. It was actually in Kirsten Liston from Rethink Compliance. It was it's in her book on training in a digital world. Selling compliance is like the job. Obviously, there's table stakes. You have to understand compliance and compliance frameworks and ethics frameworks and the guidelines, and you have to have your subject matter expertise and know how to run a compliance program. But to make it stick, you have to think like a marketer, I think. And
I agree.
And you have to bring it to people in different ways, different bites that they can digest. And over time, it's going to change the way they behave and the way they operate and their business conduct, hopefully for the better. And at the very least, what it's going to do is it's going to remind them, hey, I have a role in this. And if I see something that doesn't seem right, I should raise my hand. Because at the end of the day, that's what you want employees to do. You want them to fly right and tell when somebody else is not flying right, or at least, send up a red flare. And so from my perspective, building those relationships I talked about with the Boeing International folks and the different, the BAE regional leaders, you build those relationships and gain some credibility, and you talk about what you're trying to do, and you invite their input. There's a
respiration there, exactly. There's an in and out there. Yeah, exactly.
And so it becomes a virtuous circle. And at the end of the day, hopefully, if you've done it right, you'll have some resonance, and you'll see your inquiries to the helpline higher than your allegations to the helpline, and then you can also give good customer service to those inquiries and to those allegations, so that the worst case scenario is someone calls the helpline, they have a bad experience, they tell their friends, whatever you do, don't call the helpline.
So 100%. I mean, everyone's talking about all their experiences. If they have a bad interaction with their boss, they're telling their best friend at work. If they call the helpline and they're raced off the phone or whatever, like all of that kind of spreads, and that totally influences. I mean, because we already have so many headwinds to get this risk intelligence and get this participation, which is necessary for us to even do our job, because most of us are sitting in an office or, sitting at home when the quote unquote wrongdoing or the non-compliance is happening in all these different spots. Like you said, it's individuals who are making decisions as to whether to comply with something, whether from ignorance or whether from, trying to violate something. Why are we still talking about this? Not like, why are we still having the podcast? But like, to me, it's all marketing. To me, it's all influence. Of course, we need to know those sort of, we need to know those, those hard sort of regulations, those hard compliance components. But to me, it's, you're speaking my language 100%. It's all influence. Why do you think that's still a gap in our space? Why do we still need to quote unquote sell ethics in a world where it seems like stakeholders, the workforce, care about an ethical workplace now more than, at least in my like recorded history?
It's a great question. I think that's the question that we're all trying to answer. I don't know if I have a great answer for that. I think, you've got leaders who are focused on the bottom line. You've got leaders who are focused on the bottom line and doing it the right way. And so those two things kind of conflict.
Okay.
So you're going to have issues with your workforce. I mean, the folks who are focusing on bottom line at all counts or all costs, that sends a message, and that tells people how to behave, or it doesn't foster the culture of people exhibiting positive business conduct. It's like, okay, and people might mishear that message and say, go get it done. It's like, oh well, go get it done. I go get it done at all costs. And then they break they bend or break rules. So in the absence of really strong leadership messaging, people get the wrong message, and that's true. Then we see more problems. And so I don't have the answer for why doesn't everybody have religion all the time about the importance of compliance and ethics and how it can actually help the bottom line, because it'll increase morale. It'll help get business done the right way. So it'll reduce the noise of investigations, violations, regulatory examinations, and all those things, which then allow you to hit your strategic objectives more directly without that additional noise.
I couldn't agree more. I do find though it a little puzzling that the average ethics professional is not in like sales mode constantly, and that could just be because the way I kind of see that we're all in sales and we're all selling ideas, and I need to get buy-in, and I need to build, trust with folks for them to comply with whatever I'm doing. It seems like it should be like a major pillar of any sort of, it should be a major tool in the toolbox of any ethics and compliance person to like be getting smart on behavioral science, be getting smart on how to be a better marketer and how to, say things 7 times, 7 ways or whatever it is.
I think the reality, Nick, is that, any compliance officer, anybody who works in compliance has a very full plate, and it's not getting, not getting smaller. And, you're expected to do more with less continually all the time. I mean, unless you're in one of those near-death situations where resources are plenty, which for most companies are, few and far between.
Right.
Which is a good thing. We don't want more companies having near-death experiences. But when there's so much coming at you to get done and so many demands on your time, it's oftentimes hard to manage what seems like the easy part, which is the marketing and the messaging. But that has to be an intrinsic part of the entire program and built out and resourced. And it doesn't have to be costly.
No, it doesn't. Especially today, right? I mean, with AI, with Canva, I mean, there's been so much democratization of like marketing, tools, let's say.
Right. I think the most expensive part of the art exhibition that we did a few years back, I had cookies made that had the values frosted on them for everybody, for all the kids to take home. And that was like $400.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. I don't know. I really find this to be a really fascinating industry. I kind of found, I kind of stumbled into this industry myself in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And it's such a bouquet of so many different things that you have to be good at to be like really effective. And it's ever changing. And the thickness of the veil of attention that we need to pierce through in order to like influence somebody seems to be changing all the time as well. There's just, it feels like there's so much opportunity in it right now.
There is. And the reality is not many people wake up or are born saying, I want to be a chief compliance and ethics officer. Maybe now they are. It's a little more of a household kind of field than it was when I got my start, or I'm sure when you got your start.
Yeah. Yeah. We're starting to see it in MBA schools and things like that.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe we're already over time, man. I could
Oh,
keep talking to you all day here, man. I appreciate you coming on so much.
it's been my
Um,
pleasure.
so do you have time for one more question? This is like my favorite all time question.
As long as it's not a really hard one, sure.
All right. If you could go back in time to a young Mike, what piece of advice do you wish you had earlier?
Oh boy. I think I got some really good, the whole work ethic thing that I talked about earlier was probably one of the best things I ever got. I would have studied harder in college, in undergrad.
Don't have so much fun.
I had a lot of fun. I had enough fun that if I have that, I still would have had a lot of fun and studied more. And now I've got two kids. One just graduated and one's halfway through. And that's what I've always told them is just study, take these opportunities, study hard, and doors will open so much more for you.
So true.
And for me, I think having gone to law school has opened so many more doors for me. Even though I didn't practice law for a long time in a firm, that just having that background and having sort of the burnished law degree in the background, I don't know that I'd be in the position that I've been in for the roles that I've had without that.
Man,
So
it's such a cool story. That's great advice. You really have a really cool story, and I really could have talked to you for a whole nother hour because we were just starting to scratch the surface on this decade where you kind of came in during the storm and you did so many more cool things. So would love to have you on again or just connect again because I really learned
sounds
a lot.
great.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
eyeballing that little decanter you have on the table.
Yeah, we'll have to crack this baby open.
That sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. See you next
My
time.
pleasure. Thanks, Nick.